The skies above Horizon 4 were clear that morning, a brilliant shade of blue that mirrored the vast oceans stretching across the colony's surface. Children laughed in the streets, workers bustled through the market districts, and starships glided between the towering structures of the capital city, Ardentia. It was a place of progress, a beacon of human ingenuity and resilience. No one expected death to fall from the sky. It began with a single explosion. A cargo freighter, inbound from the outer trade routes, suddenly erupted in a ball of fire above the city's spaceport. The shockwave shattered windows for miles, sending debris cascading onto the streets below. Before the alarms could even sound, more ships followed, descending from orbit in tight formations. The Xivor had come. The first strikes targeted communication hubs and planetary defenses. Military installations burned before they could mount a response. Soldiers scrambled to coordinate, but their orders never reached the front lines. Within minutes, every major city on the planet was under siege. The Xivor did not send a declaration of war. They did not issue demands. They simply killed. Ardentia was the first to fall. Its towering spires crumbled as plasma bombardments rained down from above. Civilians fled in terror, their screams drowned by the deafening roar of collapsing infrastructure. Parents clutched their children, shielding them from the flames as they sought refuge. But there was none. The Xivor landed in coordinated waves, their insectoid warriors emerging from dropships with ruthless efficiency. Commander Elias Vance, one of the highest-ranking officers on Horizon 4, fought to establish a defensive perimeter at the Eastern District. His forces were outmatched. The Xivor moved with practiced brutality, their soldiers advancing in disciplined formations. For every enemy they managed to bring down, 3 more took its place. Vance saw men and women he had trained for years cut down in the streets, their bodies left where they fell. He ducked behind the smoldering remains of an armored vehicle, gripping his pulse rifle as he shouted into his comms. "Control, this is Vance. We are being overrun. Requesting immediate orbital reinforcements." Silence. Then static. Then a voice, faint, panicked. "Commander, they've taken the orbital stations. There are no reinforcements. We're alone." The words struck like a hammer. He gritted his teeth and turned his gaze toward the sky. The colony's defense fleet was gone, reduced to drifting wreckage. The Xivor had planned this assault meticulously. Horizon 4 had been chosen not for conquest, but for extermination. In the city center, Dr. Jane Carlyle ran through the burning streets, her medical satchel slung over one shoulder. Blood streaked her uniform, though none of it was her own. She had been in the hospital when the first attack hit, working frantically to treat the wounded as they poured in. When the roof collapsed under the weight of a plasma strike, she barely managed to escape with a few survivors still standing. Now, she had nowhere to run. She turned a corner and skidded to a stop. Ahead, Xivor soldiers advanced through the plaza, methodically executing civilians. A mother shielded her son, pleading in a language they did not understand. The alien soldier hesitated for only a moment before driving a blade through her chest. The boy's scream was cut short by a burst of plasma fire. Jane's hands trembled as she pressed herself against the wall. Her breath came in short gasps, her mind screaming at her to move, to run, to fight. But there was nothing she could do. If she stepped forward, she would join the growing piles of corpses lining the streets. Above, the sky darkened with the silhouette of Xivor warships, their immense forms blotting out the sun. The bombing runs continued, reducing once proud structures to ruins. Power grids failed. Water supplies were contaminated. The colony's agricultural sectors burned, filling the air with the acrid scent of scorched crops and flesh. Within hours, Horizon 4 was no longer a colony. It was a graveyard. The few survivors who managed to evade capture or execution fled into the underground tunnels, hoping to escape through the old mining shafts. Vance led what remained of his unit through the crumbling corridors, every step haunted by the distant echoes of screams. He had lost too many. He couldn't afford to lose more. Jane found herself among them, her uniform stained with soot and sweat. She moved from soldier to soldier, checking wounds, administering what little aid she could. But she could see it in their eyes, the hopelessness, the despair. They had already lost. In the depths of the tunnels, Vance activated a distress beacon. Broadcasting on all emergency channels, his voice was hoarse, filled with desperation. This is Commander Elias Vance of Horizon 4. The Zyvor have slaughtered our people. We need immediate evacuation. If anyone is still listening, please respond." No answer. He clenched his fists, his breathing ragged. The Galactic Coalition had to have seen the attack, had to have known what was happening, and yet there was nothing. No fleets coming to their aid, no diplomatic interventions. Just silence. Jane sat beside a wounded soldier, pressing a bandage against his side. Her hands were steady now. There was no fear left, only exhaustion. She looked up at Vance and saw the same hollow expression mirrored in his face. "They're not coming," she whispered. He exhaled sharply, the weight of the truth settling over him like a shroud. They were alone. Zyvor had won, and Earth had done nothing. The stars above Earth burned cold and indifferent as the war room deep beneath the planet's surface filled with the murmur of voices. The chamber, hidden miles beneath the North American continent, was lined with holographic displays flashing grim statistics. The entire planet was watching, though few would ever see the inside of this room. Seated at the head of the long steel table, President Elias Langley listened in silence. His face, once full of the warmth of a leader who believed in diplomacy, was now carved in stone. His fingers tapped against the armrest of his chair as the last transmission from Horizon 4 played across the monitors. The voice of Commander Elias Vance crackled through the speakers, filled with the raw desperation of a man calling into a void. "This is Commander Elias Vance of Horizon 4. The Zyvor have slaughtered our people. We need immediate evacuation. If anyone is still listening, please respond." No one had responded. The recording ended. A hush settled over the room, broken only by the distant hum of machinery. General Marcus Caldwell, a man who had served Earth's military through decades of political restraint, exhaled sharply and leaned forward. His uniform was crisp, but his face bore the exhaustion of someone who had just watched a massacre unfold in real time. "They're all dead," he said. "We intercepted the final drone footage before the Zyvor cut all transmissions. There were no survivors." A ripple of unease passed through the room. The gathered officials, diplomats, and military leaders shifted in their seats. Some glanced toward the president, others toward the Secretary of Intergalactic Relations, a woman who had spent years negotiating peace with the same species that had now wiped out millions of humans in a matter of hours. Langley finally spoke. His voice was measured, devoid of emotion. "And the Galactic Coalition?" Silence. Then the secretary cleared her throat. They issued a statement. She gestured toward the main display and a new transmission played. A blue-skinned Zellerai representative, his elongated features twisted in what passed for sympathy among his kind, addressed the camera with the detachment of a man discussing trade disputes rather than genocide. "The attack on Horizon 4 is a regrettable tragedy. However, the Galactic Coalition recognizes the Zyvar Empire's claim to this system. We advise all parties to seek diplomatic resolution and avoid unnecessary escalation. Further hostilities will not be condoned." The message ended. Langley stared at the blank screen. He had known deep down what their response would be. The Coalition would do what it always did, nothing. To them, humanity was an upstart race, a minor power on the edge of the galaxy. Horizon 4 was just another footnote in the long history of galactic politics. He slowly rose from his chair, his movements deliberate. The room watched him with bated breath. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of something irreversible. Enough. The single word sent a ripple through the chamber. He turned to face the gathered leaders, his gaze cold and unwavering. "For centuries we have tried to be civilized," he continued. "We have played by their rules. We have signed their treaties. We have abided by their laws. And what has it brought us? Silence, indifference, genocide." He gestured toward the blank screen where the Coalition's message had played. "They tell us to seek diplomacy. They tell us to stand down. They tell us to let this go." His voice dropped, filled with quiet fury. "We will not." General Caldwell sat straighter, his eyes narrowing. "Are you saying—" "I am saying," Langley interrupted, "that Earth will no longer tolerate the slaughter of our people. We are done being civilized." The words hit the room like a shockwave. Some officials paled, others nodded grimly. Caldwell allowed himself a slow breath before asking the question that everyone feared but knew had to be spoken. "What do you propose, Mr. President?" Langley turned to the massive holomap of the galaxy displayed across the far wall. With a single motion, he expanded the section showing Zyvor-controlled space. "We send a message," he said. "Not words, not negotiations, action." He pointed to the heart of the Zyvor Empire, their industrial core, their shipyards, their fuel depots. "We strike where it hurts. We take their war machine apart piece by piece until they understand one simple truth." He looked back at the room, his expression unyielding. "You do not slaughter humans and walk away unscathed." The room was silent, each person grappling with the gravity of what was unfolding. For years, Earth had fought to maintain its place among the stars without resorting to the kind of brutality that had defined the greater empires of the galaxy. But that restraint had cost them Horizon 4. It had cost them 10 million lives. Caldwell finally spoke, his voice steady. "If we do this, there's no going back." Langley met his gaze. "We were never going back." He turned to the communications officer. "Broadcast my message across all channels. I want every human colony, every fleet, every outpost to hear these words." The officer hesitated for only a fraction of a second before nodding. The room held its breath as Langley stepped forward, his face illuminated by the cold glow of the transmission feed. The recording light flickered on. "This is President Elias Langley, speaking on behalf of Earth and all her people," he said, his voice steady as iron. "Today, the Galactic Coalition has chosen to stand by while our people are slaughtered. They expect us to grieve in silence, to bow our heads, to let this pass. But let me make one thing clear." His expression darkened, the rage of an entire species burning behind his eyes. "We do not forget, we do not forgive, and we do not stop." He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a level just above a whisper, though it carried through the speakers with the weight of a storm. "You have made a fatal mistake. Now we stop being civilized." The transmission ended. Cost every human colony, every military base, every deep space listening post. The message spread like wildfire. Soldiers clenched their fists, pilots strapped into their ships. Engineers worked through the night preparing weapons Earth had sworn never to use. And deep in the void of space, fleets that had once remained hidden in the shadows of bureaucratic restraint began to move. The war had begun. The Zyvor warlord Varash Kur stood atop the command balcony of his flagship, the Vorkalath, his mandibles twitching in satisfaction as he observed the endless rows of warships assembled before him. The Zyvor Empire had always been superior to the lesser species that infested the stars, and the recent conquest of Horizon 4 had been a demonstration of their dominance. Humanity had been warned through fire and blood that they had no place in the affairs of true empires. Yet something gnawed at him, a whisper of unease, an instinct honed through years of brutal warfare. He had expected resistance after the massacre. He had expected desperate cries for help, futile counterattacks, or the usual diplomatic whining from the Galactic Coalition. But Earth had responded with silence. Not submission, not diplomacy, just silence. He turned to his second-in-command, a towering Zyvor tactician named Luthar Rex. The warrior's red chiton glistened under the dim blue lighting of the command deck. "Have there been any movements from the humans?" Varash asked, his deep, guttural voice betraying the first hints of irritation. Luthar Rex hesitated before speaking. "No official response. Their colonies remain on high alert, but there has been no retaliation. No requests for negotiation, no diplomatic envoys." Varash narrowed his eyes. "And their fleets?" "Unaccounted for," Luthrax admitted. "All primary human military formations vanished from long-range scans shortly after the fall of Horizon 4. Their capital world has gone dark, transmitting nothing beyond standard commercial traffic. We expected their leaders to send a delegation to the coalition in protest. Instead, nothing." Varash clicked his mandibles in thought. This was not the behavior of a conquered species. Humanity should have been groveling for mercy, pleading for their other colonies to be spared. Instead, they were doing what no species had done before. They were disappearing. Before he could press further, an alert pulsed through the ship's communication network. The massive holographic display above them flickered to life, displaying real-time distress signals from a Zyvor military outpost on the edge of the Empire's inner sector. Varash straightened. "What is this?" A Zyvor officer, his exoskeleton trembling, hurried to the command dais. "Warlord, our station at Vesca 3 is under attack." Varash's mandibles clicked in disbelief. Impossible! The Vesca 3 defense grid is impenetrable. The officer hesitated before responding. It was, until now, the display shifted to live footage from the outpost. At first there was nothing but static, then the image stabilized. The Zyvor station was in chaos. Fires raged across the docking bays, wreckage littered the void, bodies, Zyvor bodies, floated lifelessly in zero gravity. The security footage showed human ships moving with terrifying precision, their hulls painted black to blend into the darkness of space. No battle formations, no transmissions, just death. Varash's claws tightened into fists. How many ships? The officer's voice shook. One. For a moment there was silence. Varish stared at the screen in disbelief. You mean a fleet of one? The officer swallowed. No, Warlord, a single human warship. Varash turned sharply to Luthar X, who was already analyzing the combat data. The feed showed the lone human ship, designated Vengeance, weaving through the Zyvor defenses with inhuman efficiency. Every time a Zyvor fighter locked onto its position, it vanished into the debris field, only to reappear seconds later, unleashing precise, devastating firepower. The Zyvor flagship at Vesca 3 attempted to retaliate, but within moments its engines erupted in a chain reaction. The ship's remains scattered into the void like shattered bones. Varash stepped forward, mandibles twitching in rage. One ship? Against an entire defense station? Lutharek's voice was grim. It wasn't just a ship, it was a message. The feed cut out. Vesca 3 was gone. Varash slammed his fist against the command console. Contact all remaining intersector outposts. I want status reports. Now! More alerts flooded in, the reports were identical. Silent human warships appearing out of nowhere, striking with ruthless precision, and then vanishing before counterattacks could be mustered. They weren't fighting for control. They weren't engaging in planetary assaults. They were erasing every piece of infrastructure the Zyvor had built to maintain their empire. Luthar Rex turned to him. Warlord, we underestimated them. This is not retaliation. This is extermination. Varash's mandibles curled into a snarl. They do not have the numbers to fight a war against us. No, Luthar Rex admitted. But they are not fighting a war. They are dismantling us piece by piece. Varash's claws dug into the steel railing as realization settled upon him. This wasn't a conventional response. Humanity had no interest in reclaiming territory or negotiating a ceasefire. They had chosen a different path, one the Zyvor had never encountered before. Total merciless vengeance. The Zyvor war machine was vast, built upon centuries of conquest, but for the first time in its history, it faced an enemy that did not seek to conquer. Humanity had learned from their killers. They were not launching invasions or sending fleets in predictable battle formations. They had turned war into a ghost story. One whispered among terrified Zyvor officers who now feared the empty void of space. Varash straightened, his resolve hardening. If it is war they want, then we shall bring them war. Lathrier hesitated. That may be their goal. Varash turned sharply. Explain. Lutharex gestured toward the map of Zyvor-controlled space, where red emergency markers blinked with increasing frequency. They are choosing their targets carefully. They are not striking our core worlds, but our supply lines, our fuel depots, our shipyards. They are forcing us to react, to spread our forces thin. If we overcommit our fleets, they will pick us apart before we even reach Earth. Varash growled, realization settling in. This was not an attack born of desperation. It was calculated, precise, and patient. Humanity had stopped being civilized, and that made them the most dangerous enemy the Zyvor had ever faced. He exhaled sharply, mandibles flaring. Then we do not give them the war they want. We take the fight to their home. Lutharex nodded, but his posture remained tense. He knew, as did every Zyvor on that bridge, that the war had already changed. The hunters had become the hunted, and for the first time in his life, Varash Kur understood fear. The Zyvor capital world Drakthal had never known war. For centuries it had stood as the beating heart of the empire, its towering citadels and endless factories producing the weapons that fueled its conquests. The city-sized starports bustled with warships coming and going, ferrying soldiers to the front lines of their endless expansion. It was a fortress, impenetrable, unchallenged. Until now. Varish-Kur stood on the high balcony of the Imperial War Command, overlooking the sprawling skyline of Drakthal. The night was quiet, but he felt none of the peace that usually came with it. The stars above had once been comforting, a reminder of the vast dominion his species had claimed. Now they felt ominous. He had not slept in days, and neither had the Empire's high command. Reports of human attacks flooded in from every sector. Shipyards reduced to silent graveyards, entire outposts abandoned without a trace, supply convoys obliterated before they even left hyperspace. The Empire was crumbling, and the worst part was that no one knew where the enemy was. He turned as Luthor Rex approached, his posture tense. "The core fleets have repositioned according to your orders, Warlord. Every entry point to Drakthal is fortified." Varash nodded. "Have the humans been detected?" Luthor Rex hesitated. "Not yet." Varash's mandibles tightened. That was what unsettled him the most. Humanity had waged this war in silence, never broadcasting their movements, never engaging in full-scale battles. They struck from the shadows, leaving nothing but ruins behind. He turned back toward the city, scanning the sky. There was no sign of enemy ships, no alarms blaring, but something felt wrong. He had spent his life conquering civilizations that had crumbled before the might of the Zyvor. He knew the taste of victory. This did not feel like victory. A sharp chime rang through the war room below. The command staff scrambled to their stations as a new alert flooded the central display. Luthor Rex rushed to a nearby console, his claws tapping furiously against the interface. His eyes widened. "Warlord!" His voice was barely a whisper. "It's happening!" Varash stormed inside, pushing past stunned officers as the main holo display flickered to life. Live feeds from the outer defense stations appeared, one after another, showing nothing but silent space. The fleet stationed above Drakthal, the largest armada the Empire had ever assembled, hovered in perfect formation, waiting. The humans were nowhere to be seen. Then, one by one, the screens turned black. It happened too fast. The outermost warships, lined up like a steel wall around the planet, flickered and died. Their reactor signatures vanished. Their weapon systems ceased transmitting. It was as if the fleet was simply shutting down. No explosions, no visible enemy fire, just silence. Varash clenched his fists. "What is this?" Luthor Rex frantically scanned for answers. "Some kind of interference. Our ships are being disabled." The warlord stepped closer to the main screen, his breath heavy. "By what?" The answer came seconds later. A single human warship, black as the void, appeared above the northern hemisphere. It did not fire. It did not move. It simply hovered there, silent and waiting. A challenge. Varash's voice was a low growl. "Fire everything we have." The order rippled through the command center. The planetary defense grid activated, hundreds of plasma turrets locking onto the lone vessel. The Zyvor fleet, still numbering in the thousands, responded with immediate aggression, unleashing a barrage of energy weapons that illuminated the night sky like an artificial sunrise. For a moment, it seemed as though the war would end in fire. Then the ship disappeared, not into hyperspace, not behind enemy lines. It simply vanished. The Zyvor fleet continued firing at empty space, their weapons cutting through the void with no target. Panic spread through the command channels as ships began losing contact with one another. Officers screamed into their comms, demanding answers that no one had. Then, without warning, explosions tore through the fleet. One ship at a time, Zyvor vessels erupted into flames, their engines detonating in synchronized bursts. It was methodical, precise, an execution, not a battle. The planet's defenses, so carefully constructed to withstand invasions, were rendered useless against an enemy that did not follow the rules of war. Varash turned to Luthor Rex, his voice edged with desperation. "How are they doing this?" Luthor Rex stared at the screens, his expression hollow. "We never found their fleet, because they were already here." Varish's blood ran cold. Humanity had not brought an armada. They had not waged a war of numbers. They had infiltrated the Empire's own systems, disabling entire ships before they could react, sabotaging weapons before they were fired. The moment Drakthal had raised its shields, the war had already been lost. The capital itself fell next. The first detonations came from within the planetary security grid. Underground power stations erupted, throwing entire city sectors into darkness. Communications blacked out. The central power cores collapsed, leaving the Empire's high command blind and deaf. And then the screaming began. It came not from the command center nor from the fleet above, but from the streets. Zyvor civilians poured out of their homes, fleeing from unseen attackers. The city's security forces fought back, but the enemy was nowhere to be seen. The war had never been about destroying fleets or claiming territory. It had been about breaking the Zyvor from the inside out. Barash stood frozen, watching as his empire burned. He had led his people to countless victories. He had crushed rebellions, exterminated species, shaped the galaxy through sheer force. But this was not a battle he could fight. He turned as the war room doors slid open. A single human stood there, clad in black armor, his face unreadable. He did not speak. He did not raise a weapon. He simply stepped forward, allowing the silence to stretch between them. Barash reached for his sidearm, his mandibles tightening, but the human merely tilted his head. "We could have talked," the man said, his voice calm, almost disappointed. "But you didn't listen." Barash fired. The shot never landed. The human moved faster than his eyes could follow, closing the distance in a single step. A blade, unseen until now, slid across his vision. The warlord fell to his knees, his strength draining. The last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was Drakthal in flames, and the realization that he had made a mistake far greater than underestimating humanity. He had made them angry. The smoke over Drakthal had not yet settled when the first message was transmitted. It was not sent in secret, it was not encrypted, it was not delivered through the careful channels of diplomacy. It was blasted across every frequency in the known galaxy, from the depths of the Zyvor Empire's ruined homeworld to the pristine halls of the Galactic Coalition. No one could ignore it. The screen flickered, the image stabilized. President Elias Langley stood before the camera, his expression carved from stone, his eyes cold with the weight of a man who had led his species into war and emerged victorious. "This is President Elias Langley, speaking on behalf of Earth and all of humanity." His voice carried through the transmission like a verdict, final and absolute. The Zyvor Empire no longer exists. He let the words settle. Across the galaxy, on hundreds of planets, millions of beings listened in stunned silence. Langley continued, "For decades we sought peace. We joined your councils, signed your treaties, obeyed your laws. When our colony was massacred, we waited for justice. We received silence." His jaw tightened, his fists clenched at his sides. "We learned then that the only justice in this galaxy is the one we make ourselves." The transmission cut to footage from Drakthal's final hours. The once mighty fleet lay in ruins, shattered husks drifting lifelessly through space. The capital city burned, its streets empty save for the echoes of a civilization that had believed itself untouchable. No human soldiers were visible. No occupying forces stood among the wreckage. Humanity had not conquered, they had simply erased. The screen returned to Langley. "To those who believe this war is over, know this: it was never a war. This was an execution." The air itself seemed to still as he leaned forward, his next words carrying a warning that no species could afford to ignore. "We are done being civilized. If another empire dares to raise a hand against our people, we will not argue, we will not negotiate, we will not stop, we will end you." He stepped back. The transmission faded. Across the galaxy, the message repeated on an endless loop, a reminder written in fire and silence. The Galactic Coalition convened in an emergency session the next day. Their council chambers, once filled with the usual posturing and bureaucracy, were gripped by something new: fear. For centuries, the Coalition had debated laws and policies, mediating between warring species, issuing sanctions when necessary. But they had never seen anything like this. The Zyvor Empire, one of the most powerful forces in the galaxy, was gone. Humanity had not taken their worlds, they had not claimed their resources. They had simply reduced them to ashes and walked away. The Zari ambassador, his elongated features drawn tight with barely concealed horror, spoke first. "We must issue an official statement." "To whom?" another council member snapped. "The humans do not seek diplomacy, they do not seek reparations, they seek nothing." The chamber fell silent. No one knew what to say. In the farthest reaches of space, where the remnants of the Zyvor military fled like insects in the dark, a lone warlord sat in the ruins of his command deck. His ship drifted, power failing, the last of his kind. He played the human transmission again, his mandibles trembling. We do not forget. We do not forgive, and we do not stop. He had once believed humanity was weak. He had believed their restraint was cowardice, their diplomacy a sign of fear. He understood now. He had seen it firsthand. Humanity had not been weak. They had been merciful, and now that mercy was gone. Across the galaxy, fleets repositioned, armies prepared, but none would dare move against Earth. Not now. Not ever. For the first time in history, the galaxy did not see humanity as an upstart species struggling to claim its place among the stars. They saw a warning, a force that, when pushed too far, would become something no empire could survive. And so, as the smoke of war faded and the stars above Drakthal shone once more, the galaxy was left with a single, undeniable truth. Humanity had stopped being civilized, and nothing would ever be the same again.